no umbrella.
Well, great. Let's maybe kick things off. First of all, thank you all for joining us this morning. We're going to try and cover a fair amount of material around this theme of disruptive innovation in cybersecurity. But we want to try and leave a little bit of time at the end in case there are questions. If there aren't questions, we'll fill that void rather easily. My name is Bob Ackerman. I'm the founder and managing director of AllegisCyber. We're a cybersecurity venture capital firm. Actually, it turns out we're the first dedicated cyber venture firm in the world. And we've been operating in this space for about 20 years. Really pleased to have 4 CEOs with us today that I think really kind of encapsulate and represent what we want to talk about. Ellison and Williams, the founder and CEO of Enveil. Karim Hijazi, the founder and CEO of Prevailion. Terry Dunlap, the co-founder and CTO of Refirm Labs. And Gregg Smith, the co-founder and CEO of Attila. And maybe before we jump into talking about each of the companies, maybe just to sort of level set a little bit. You know, if you look at the world today, there's a lot of talk about cybersecurity. I can take you back even 5 years ago when we talked about our investment focus in cybersecurity, and people say, well, isn't that a little narrow? You know, we don't have that conversation anymore. It turns out that everything that we're doing as individuals, moving online, digitizing our lives, everything that's taking place in the enterprise in terms of digitization, basically is moving all of our behavior into the threat zone for cyber attacks. And as a result, you see a number of very interesting phenomena developing in this space. Last year, in the US alone, there were in excess of 1,000 reported cybersecurity attacks. And the fact that cybersecurity is sort of manifesting itself as the existential risk to us as individuals and to enterprises has led to a phenomenal explosion in not only the awareness of cybersecurity risk and exposure, but also investments in innovation in these areas to try and mitigate those risks. Turns out cybersecurity is the fastest growing area of information technology innovation. Depends on whose numbers you want to use. Budgets this year will be somewhere in the $120 to $140 billion. So from an investment perspective, it's not only a greenfield opportunity, it's a very large, rapidly growing, essential area of innovation, but it's an area, interestingly enough, where all of the innovation is taking place actually on the private side of the equation. If we have time, we might dig into a little bit of why that is taking place. Today, you've got about 3,500 cybersecurity companies, private cybersecurity companies around the world. The concentration is in the US. There's a fair amount of activity coming out of Israel, a little bit of activity out of Europe, and that principally on the good side of the equation is where the innovation is taking place. It doesn't mean there isn't innovation taking place in some of the darker regions of the world where the intent is perhaps a little more nefarious, and we'll touch on that today. That 3,500 companies attracted $6.7 billion of venture capital investing last year, so an all-time high. You know, if you go back 5 years ago, the number was under $1 billion. So the understanding of cybersecurity, the importance of cybersecurity, those IT budgets increasing for cybersecurity has had the predictable effect of attracting a lot of capital, trying to identify innovation that can be funded to tackle some of the problems that we're dealing with in this area. Last year, you saw 183 M&A transactions related to cybersecurity companies, representing $15.5 billion of transaction volume. You saw 5 IPOs of cybersecurity companies. And in broad generalization, you saw that cybersecurity companies were performing materially better than the S&P 500. And part of the dynamic here is if you buy into the premise that cybersecurity is that existential risk, that the only way you can mitigate that risk is through innovation. All of the innovation in cybersecurity actually takes place on the private side of the equation. You have a lot of very large public companies that want to participate in cybersecurity, but can't effectively innovate themselves. So the way they enter the marketplace is through acquisition. You get this very interesting flywheel of a lot of innovation going against a big market with a series of dynamics that actually make this sector particularly interesting. The challenge, of course, as we've seen time and time again in the venture capital community, is that when there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of noise. And what's happened in cybersecurity over the last 5 years in particular is the noise level has gotten very, very high. The signal is there, but the signal's being overwhelmed by a lot of noise. Do we need 3,500 cybersecurity companies? Absolutely not. Part of the problem we're dealing with is that many of them up in Silicon Valley, you've got a half a dozen or a dozen companies basically doing the same thing with very little differentiation. And so the theme that we wanted to tackle today is a little bit about what are the areas of really disruptive innovation, what is the source of that disruptive innovation, and what makes it different. And from an investor's perspective, that's what's key to understand and to be able to identify. All of our companies today are all based in Maryland. And people look at that and say, well, Maryland, Silicon Valley, why Maryland? And it turns out that there's some very interesting parallels in Maryland to the origins of Silicon Valley. You look at the origins of Silicon Valley, the success that we think of as Silicon Valley today has its roots in World War II, where the U.S. Department of Defense was making massive investments in innovation at key universities around the country in areas of innovation that were essential to winning the war effort. Stanford and Berkeley both participated in that. Berkeley got atomic weapons. Turned out after the war there wasn't a lot of commercial application for atomic weapons. Probably a good thing. Stanford, however, got what became known as integrated circuits back in the vacuum tube days and microwave technology. And it turns out after the war they had a center of excellence in those areas of technology, and there was broad commercial application for that technology. And that really was the roots of what we think of as Silicon Valley today. When you look at cybersecurity and you look at where those massive investments in cybersecurity innovation taking place, they're in Maryland, courtesy of the US government. So there's a very interesting pattern that we see repeating itself. And what you see within the intelligence community, within the US government, is massive investments for decades in areas that we now think of as cybersecurity and data science. And so if you want to look at where the most advanced technology, those playbooks that basically are shaping the entire marketplace are being developed, they're actually being developed inside of the intelligence community. And what we'll be talking today is about 4 companies, 4 examples of leveraging that expertise into the broader market to apply that expertise against the commercial landscape, building companies in the process. My observation, having been in cybersecurity for 20 years, is that the intelligence community is operating 5 to 6 years ahead of the commercial market segment. It's making investments that the commercial segment can't really make because the problem's a little too far off in the future, or they're developing offensive playbooks from a nation state, national security perspective that eventually end up in the wild as sort of the toolkit that protagonists use to put all of us at risk in cyberspace. I think one of the really interesting things that comes out of this environment is that when you get into the intelligence community, there is a fundamental understanding that cyberspace has a fabric. And there's an understanding of how that fabric is structured, how it can be manipulated, how it can be controlled, how it can be leveraged. And that gives operators in that domain a very, very particular set of experience and perspectives that are particularly useful in developing and anticipating attack vectors and how to mitigate those attack vectors and the protagonists that pursue those attack vectors. So maybe with that as a preamble, I'm going to ask each of our CEOs, founders, just to briefly introduce yourself, a little tiny bit on your background, and a brief discussion of what you're working on. So Karim, shall we start with you?
Sure, happy to. So my name is Karim Hijazi. I'm the founder and CEO of Prevailion. My background, not going too far back, starts really sort of around 2010 when I formed a company that was focused on looking at the command and control infrastructure associated with these threats that Bob's talking about, at least a portion of these threats. And what that means in lay terms is when something nefarious manifests or is deployed into an organization, it has to communicate outbound to its master, its owner, its operator to get further directives or to deliver whatever it's stolen. That was an interesting vector for us on the good side to sort of implicate that. That's when they come out of the shadows a little bit. Every other time it's a little bit more of a touch and go whack-a-mole approach. So that was an interesting opportunity. That company was acquired by Mandiant, an organization that was since acquired by FireEye in 2013. My company was acquired in 2012. I led intelligence efforts there for that year. Most notably, we did the APT-1 report, which was about the Chinese implications on the Defense Industrial Base at the time and their efforts to harvest intellectual property and everything else, unfortunately. Took some time off, came back around to revisit the problem, but on a slightly different angle. What seemed to be manifesting and what was a little bit more of a conversation when I started to look at this again was the third-party risks. And what I mean by that isn't explicitly supply chain, which tends to garner the headlines a little more, which is a very, very big issue. Love to hear Terry's thoughts on that specifically. But more just the entire ecosystem of third-party. So that's customers, partners, vendors. You look at the Targets, the Lockheed Martins, in this case, in theory, almost like the Marriotts of the world with SPG. That was an acquisition. It wasn't per se a third party, but it was another organization merging into one that caused a pretty big mess. So how could we address that? How could we take similar methodologies from the unvalence era and Mandiant era and apply it here? And what we've been able to do is derive a really good victimology and telemetry dashboard and data set that lets us say, okay, company X, Y, or Z, wherever you are, this is your ecosystem around you, and this is an actively compromised group that you need to be careful of. I use a medical analogy or health-related one, which is, it's one thing to say that we like our friend Jeff who comes to lunch with us and has a very bad immune system. We're still going to let him come to lunch with us. But if Jeff unfortunately contracts airborne Ebola and starts coughing at the table, I'm not going to go to that lunch. And that's the equivalency of a lot of these relationships where if you need to stifle or throttle the connection with that third party, it would be great to know if they are actually contagious from a cyber perspective. And yeah.
Good starting point. Thank you, Karim.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm Ellison Ann Williams. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Enveil. So Enveil is a data security company that focuses exclusively on securing data in use, when it's being used or processed by things like searches or analytics. So broad horizontal applicability across the commercial space, but we get our start inside of the US intelligence community, specifically where I spent the majority of my career as a PhD mathematician, inside of the National Security Agency, where we needed to perform trusted compute, so run these searches or analytics in data environments that we considered to be completely untrusted. So working on those problems that were really 10 years beyond anything that the commercial world ever was thinking about to prevent against things like nation-state attack vectors.
Great. Gregg?
Yeah, my name is Gregg Smith. I'm the CEO of Attila Security. And unlike my peers, I'm a serial entrepreneur, but my co-founder actually started at the NSA at the age of 16. He's currently 24. And initially in the agency, his goal was to allow non-technical leadership to connect securely to a top secret network by a very small network appliance. Had the opportunity to meet Vesh very early on, and I brought a team to surround Vesh as we are working very closely with the government and enterprise to secure the supply chain. And we've got a number of customers right now that are utilizing this small appliance and our cloud services to ensure that the data communication link and the storage component within a supply chain is secure.
Terry.
I'm Terry Dunlap, co-founder of Refirm Labs. I actually worked on the offensive side of the ball at the National Security Agency. My job there for over 5 years was to find vulnerabilities in embedded devices, what we now call IoT today. Find those vulnerabilities, figured out if they could be exploited, and then weaponize them. So we decided to leave the agency after 5 years and start our first company, which was a government contracting company doing the same thing, but for a wider audience. And that's where we developed an automated platform to rapidly reverse engineer these firmware images to help us get them to be weaponized. And we happened to see some investors who saw us and brought to our attention that there's this whole marketplace where we could actually help defend these IoT devices instead of hack them all the time. So we decided to create Refirm Labs. We spun that out of my existing company. And now we actually help OEMs, ODMs, telecommunications companies actually secure their supply chain, because a lot of this technology is coming from manufacturers over in China. And if time permits, I have some very interesting and thrilling stories I'm willing to share with you if we want to go down that road.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I want to start a little bit with Ellison. And you're on the data science side, and the areas where you and your team have been operating, has been described by the technology has been described as sort of the holy grail of computing. It's how do you, if the objective of many cyber attacks is to access data, how do you secure the data in a way that it's insulated from attack? At the same time, be able to use it, be able to process it. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the inspiration for the development effort that you led at the NSA, and sort of the attributes of the environment that gave you this 10-year jump on the commercial sector?
Oh, absolutely. So when we were inside of the agency, as I mentioned before, we had the need for mission reasons to perform trusted compute. So run these searches, run these analytics that contained highly sensitive indicators to us that we needed to protect as they were being processed in locations that we considered to be completely untrusted. So what that translates into, as Bob was alluding to from a technical perspective, is taking that search and encrypting it within our trusted walls, sending that encrypted search out into the untrusted environment, and having it processed there in a completely encrypted state where nothing is ever decrypted in that untrusted space. So that problem space turns out to be a perfect use case for a special type of encryption called homomorphic encryption. It's often considered to be, as Bob pointed out, the holy grail of encryption because it allows you to perform those kinds of operations, those searches, those analytics in the completely encrypted domain as if they were in the unencrypted space. The problem with that is that, over its 30-year lifespan, it had been very computationally intensive or slow. So possible, but not practical. So we were faced with needing to solve that problem from a mathematical standpoint. So being a mathematician running the team that was doing that, we were optimally positioned to take a very hard and close look at that problem space. As it turns out, we were able to achieve significant breakthroughs there that brought that holy grail of encryption from the land of the completely impractical days or hours even, hours or days to process these encrypted searches down to simply seconds or milliseconds. So we developed those breakthroughs, and then after quite a series of events, we're able to bring that core tech cleanly out of the agency, use it to seed and start the company Enveil a little over 2.5 years ago at this point. So that type of holy grail of encryption, where you're keeping everything encrypted during processing, is really closing off all of your nation-state attack surface as they're coming in and trying to steal that data while it's being processed. It's not good enough to just secure it at rest on the file system, because nation states will wait very, very patiently until you go use or process that data when it gets decrypted off of the file system, out of your database and into memory. And then it's easy, they just take it away. But if you can never decrypt it at any point during processing, then it achieves a nation-state security posture where any nation-state that's in that environment has no chance of being able to see any of that sensitive information as it's being processed. So that nation-state drive was what led us to do what we did inside of the agency.
I think one of the really interesting things when you talk about it, it's, people talk about why do you see so much innovation, coming out of the intelligence community, out of the NSA in particular, and part of it is it's sort of spy versus spy at the highest level. Our most advanced and sophisticated actors against our adversaries' most advanced and sophisticated capabilities. So the state of the art, if you will, is very, very high, with a national security imperative and near unlimited budgetary resources given to the brightest people the NSA could find to develop those capabilities. And so you find centers of excellence there that frankly don't exist in industry. It's my own experience in this area is I started working with ex-offensive guys, probably 7 or 8 years ago coming out of the NSA. And people say, why the offensive guys? It's because they're all sneaky bastards. And I mean that in a very complimentary way. It's people that understand that fabric of cyberspace, and understand how to manipulate it, understand how to leverage it, how to control it to achieve nation-state objectives, are wired in a particular way. They have an understanding of that fabric, which is proactive as opposed to reactive. And so if you can take that expertise and apply it to the defensive side of the equation, they have an understanding that anybody who operates in a pure reactive defensive environment simply doesn't have. Terry, you come from that environment. You're one of those sneaky bastards that I love. So talk a little bit about that experience and segueing, leveraging that experience to the defensive side of the equation.
So yeah, I mean, we come from a world where, I mean, we think like criminals. So we're looking for ways to break into these places. And that's our only objective, is how do we get in? How do we bypass any type of defensive measure that they have installed? And Ellison is right. I mean, I've been that patient nation-state actor waiting for an admin to log into a box somewhere remotely overseas to perform some action so I can steal information. That's what we were doing. So we've leveraged that innate ability that the team has to think like these attackers and criminals and actually help companies identify the telltale signs that you're dealing with somebody sophisticated. So for example, we had a Fortune 500 company approach us that had some concerns about some security cameras that they had deployed. And they were manufactured by, of course, a Chinese manufacturer, the second largest surveillance manufacturer in China, Dahua. The number one manufacturer is Hikvision, which the Wall Street Journal discovered was 42% owned by the Chinese government. So Dahua, we actually got the cameras, we reversed engineered them, and we started looking at the firmware. Now, IoT devices in general are very poorly put together. So there's a lot of sloppy coding practices. Engineers leave in test accounts and stuff like that that can be remotely accessed. And we usually advise them to take this stuff out, clean up their code. We found a back door in the Dahua camera. And we suggested to this Fortune 500 company, this doesn't look accidental. Based on our experience and what we've done to our adversaries, this is intentional. So they started to look for telltale signs of nefarious traffic around these security cameras. Within 36 hours of us contacting them, I receive a text message from the digital security trust officer with a firewall log attached that said, you guys were spot on. Look what we found. And it was their corporate network traffic being sent through the cameras to Chinese IP addresses. Now, this isn't the first instance. I can name names of some other companies that are out there, especially one that's in the news trying to sue the US government right now, that have done very similar tactics. So that's just one example of utilizing this expertise, this knowledge, this offensive side emanating from the NSA and how we can apply it to help companies defend themselves and reveal these things that traditional security solutions can't tell you. There's not a product on the market right now that will be able to tell you if your device has a Chinese backdoor. But with our platform, we can give you that information plus a lot of other stuff that would scare the hell out of you.
And it seems like this becomes really important when to your point, Terry, I mean, we're seeing this explosion of IoT devices. These devices are designed to be functional. They typically are designed to hit lower price points in most cases. The origin, a lot of the underlying technology is questionable, at least it's not certified. As long as they work, everything is assumed to be good. But in fact, what's happened is that these tens of billions of devices which are proliferating around the world are in fact inherently insecure, sometimes by design, where there's an intelligence objective attached to it. And it's an entirely new vector that the traditional enterprise-focused cybersecurity industry is just not geared to deal with. It's just, security for many years, I go back early in my career, security was, did you lock the computer room? And you didn't have the level of connectivity you have today. You didn't have the data interconnectivity you have today. You didn't have the velocity you have today. So we're dealing with this 50-year-old architecture with artifacts that just do not have security as a design criteria. And we're playing catch-up in a lot of these situations. At the same time, this digitization is exploding devices on a global basis, making us more and more vulnerable. So I think it's a great example of where that cutting-edge offensive capability actually turns out to develop expertise that has very, very broad, commercial applicability against this explosive growth of IoT devices. Karim, you guys are doing some really, really interesting things around, so much of threat intelligence today when people think about threat intelligence, it's like, I want to see the bad guys coming as far as I can, or at least an indication that they're coming. I want to raise the walls as fast as I can. And then when they get inside the wall, I want to find and kill them as quickly as I can. It tends to be a very reactive approach. A lot of the energy is reactive. It's forensics after attack. It's understanding what happened and how did it happen. You guys have kind of flipped the playbook in that area. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great point there. It's funny to sort of validate your point. 10, 12 years ago, it was the commentary was, if you get hacked, and then it sort of moved into when you get hacked, and it's not a matter of if anymore. And today, I'd venture to say is how long have you been hacked, right? It's sadly the reality. So the mindset that was required from the cybersecurity teams and all that to change from what's ingressing, what's coming and pounding on the outside of the walls, what's effectively trying to get its way in, had to be shifted to, well, let's consider it's already in here now. Like you said, a little bit, and it's sadly still very reactive. That's true. That's the unfortunate part of it. So what you're addressing is exactly it. We said, let's take this asymmetric, and I know it's a little bit of an overused term, but let's make this a little more symmetric. Let's start getting them to worry a little more about whether their networks are infiltrated to some degree by the good guys, which is an interesting paradigm to play with, because the way we achieve our objective is to, what I like to say is sort of biopsy a very small piece of that ad hoc network they've devised out there, which is all out on the internet. This has nothing to do with getting on the inside of the organization. So what we're doing is a lot more on a broad, much higher layer than, say, where Terry and Ellison and live, which is much more interesting for saying, these guys are now in there, let's guard what is actually sacred. We're saying, okay, let's look at the vectors, let's look at the movement, let's see where these guys are doing. Back to the third party piece about the lateral movement. What we're trying to change people's perception on is, okay, look, you may have issues, but once we address that in a sort of instant response capacity, let's look at that lateral movement from that partner, because that malware, very patiently waiting for the right time, is going to find a way to get to you through weak OPSEC of that partner and get into your environment. And when that happens, it's going to call back out. That's when we can intercept it and tell you back, hey, this is what happened. It even goes so far as to say, we can conceivably grab what was taken, or at least a copy of it. It's not certainly returning stolen goods. It doesn't work like a flat screen TV. We don't get the flat screen TV back for you. We get a copy of it to say this was what was taken, and sorry. Better yet, if they can take it and it was encrypted and it's useless, that's the best case scenario there. But yeah, so the reactive nature of this is very, very hard to overcome, because this is years and years and years of sort of being drilled into the heads of, well, when it happens, let's react to it. This is the whole pen test approach. Let me go and see if there's actually any vulnerabilities. If there are, okay, fine. But if nothing happens, why bother?
And I think, too, this is what you're hearing is a commonality around companies who originate inside of the intelligence community, in that the nation state security posture and attack vectors are in our blood and our DNA. So we don't have to learn it, it just is there. And that's always the bar that we're shooting for and protecting against. Whereas in a lot of other areas, to your point, Bob, people have to learn what is nation state security, what is a nation state attack vector. And so they're already behind the curve.
And one last thing that, just to your point, they don't have to work that hard. This is the sad part about it. What we'd like to think is these guys work really, really hard, and they have to build these extremely expensive, architectures, infrastructures. I'm finding malware that should have been eradicated 15 years ago that is still blisteringly screaming out to the internet from extremely, I have the S&P 500 that I look at on a day-to-day basis, and the vast majority of them have malware that's over 15 years old that's still communicating out to a command and control infrastructure. So it's a sad state of affairs. That is stuff that an AV, a conventional AV, should be able to catch. So when you're at that level, imagine the nation state level stuff that is, it's taking candy from a baby.
Well, Karim, I remember one demonstration to a major corporate partner, we'll say, unnamed, right?
Right.
Where you sat down with their CISO, and we were talking about how do we have the conversation. It's like, forget the deck, just pull up the screen and show them their presence on the internet.
Yeah.
And in this conversation, there's two beacons in Europe, You know who I'm talking
know
about.
exactly what you're talking about.
And he says, what's that? He says, that's your organization leaking like a sieve. And here's what did it, and here's who's controlling it.
That's right.
And here's the IP address, the physical address of that IP address in Moscow. And I think once he picked himself off the floor, so I got to make a phone call.
Right.
But it was that not waiting for the bad news, but actually seeing an attack in process, underway, which really compresses the time to react. Because one of the things we all talk about, right, is that the latency between an attack beginning and an attack being discovered, has been around 270 days. Those are the numbers that get used, so roughly 9 months. So anything you can do to compress that time to awareness allows you to engage and mitigate the damage from that attack. And so what you're doing really compresses that level of awareness to this is happening right now.
That's right.
Which fundamentally changes the game.
Yeah, it's not vulnerability, it's compromise. And the sense of urgency does dramatically shift. And it's much more of a triage scenario, tourniqueting a hemorrhaging wound versus saying, well, let me go get some antibiotics and go figure out what's going on.
Well, I think one of the interesting things you alluded to as well is talking about supply chains.
That's right.
And Terry, you talked about this as well. I mean, it's one thing to think about an enterprise doing everything that it can to secure itself, but a case in point was the Target compromise, coming up on 5 years ago, where it was the supply chain. Target was state of the art, massive IT budget, very sophisticated capabilities. And where are the bad guys you come in from? They came in through the heating and air conditioning subcontract.
Trusted partner.
Who was nothing nefarious, but they were the point of weakness. The bad guys compromised them, and they walked the malware into the target network and plugged it in and off to the races. So when you think about cyber, you can't just think about the enterprise. You have to think about the entire supply chain that at some level has digital interconnectivity, and that's just a freeway on-ramp into an organization, so that awareness of the supply chain becomes really important.
That's the real attack surface now.
Yeah.
It's everything. Yeah.
So it used to be, are you a target? Everyone's a target. It's just the entry point into the network now has many, many, many doors attached to it. Gregg, you guys operate in the domain of communications.
Correct.
Where everything that we do today from a digital perspective involves communications. The definition of, people's satisfaction with communications is they can get dial tone, they can make a call, they can get connected. Security really has been a distant secondary consideration for many years to functionality, and adversaries understand that. And so, the ability to intercept that communications, wherever it may take place, to be that man in the middle, if you will, intercepting data, becomes a key tool or technique for the bad guys. Talk about sort of the inspiration. You talked a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Sure.
But where that came from, but more than that, the importance of that and kind of where you see the traction and sort of the awareness of that problem in industry.
Yeah, so certainly, all of us have talked about the growth of IP and, whether it's Terry on the IoT side, myself within the supply chain, myself within mobile devices, there's just proliferation everywhere. The communication links are weak. It could be your mobile device and a phone call. I've done 2 companies in the mobile security space prior to Attila. Terry talked about the video cameras and the hack. My company is actually working now on securing the video link for that particular Fortune 500 company. We're also working on.
Well, you identified. You create a lead for Gregg. I mean, it's all good.
It works out really well. Bob, you talked about the Target hack. Even our government is not secure in their supply chain or their IP connected devices. A very pronounced situations happened with the United States Navy where we lost to the Chinese government our stealth capabilities of our submarine fleet. And my company right now is working on that. So whether it's a phone, whether it's a laptop, a tablet, whether it's the cameras that Terry talked about or any IoT device, it's that data link between point A and point B. And that's really, Bob, what we're trying to solve is really making sure that link from point A to point B is secure. And then the data on the back side of that is in a secure location as well, so somebody can access that vendor information, that communication, that data is secure as well.
It's really interesting, kind of going back to the metaphor of working with a 50-year-old architecture. When I look at cybersecurity today, it's almost like looking at a dike with 1,000 holes in it. And we're running around trying to plug every one of those holes. And that's necessary because if too much water comes through the dike, we're going to get wet, and that's the bad news. I think where cybersecurity needs to go going forward is we need to begin to think about how do we stop the water from coming through the dike. Rather than being reactive, which tends to be where a lot of the cybersecurity investment dollars are going today, to being proactive. Data science approaches like what you're doing, Ellison, that basically make data inherently secure. So even when a network is compromised, the data remains safe. Or what Gregg is doing in terms of make sure the data is safe when it's moving around. Karim giving folks, real-time intelligence in terms of bad things are coming your way. Let's get ahead of it as fast as we possibly can. And Terry basically securing this explosive new domain of embedded systems and IoT devices. Cybersecurity is one of those areas where second best isn't good enough. So the question is how do you get as close to the pinnacle of offensive tactics and offensive understanding as you possibly can to convert that knowledge to a defensive posture and try and compress the threat vectors and threat landscape as much as you can to make it a little bit more of a balanced fight as opposed to the reactive, always waking up to bad news and trying to figure out what do we do about the bad news. How do we reduce the bad news? How do we minimize the opportunities for the bad guys to generate bad news to enhance our posture? Understanding that this problem is likely in the foreseeable future not to be solved, but it is definitely an arms race mentality. You all trace either your origins or the origins of your technical capabilities back to the intelligence community. So I think kind of delivering on my premise, that the U.S. intelligence community, Maryland really is that Silicon Valley of cybersecurity. We're leveraging these massive government investments in cutting-edge innovation. But the National Security Agency is not known as an entrepreneurial hotbed. We think of it as an R&D shop with state-of-the-art capabilities, developing trade craft, developing technology that is just cutting edge. I want to talk a little bit about your journey, from as I say, from practice to product. How do you take that expertise, and commercialize around that expertise? It's different. It's one thing to compromise a Polycom sitting on a desk in some foreign country that may or may not be plugged in, okay, now what do I do with that expertise to secure IoT devices, in Terry's case, around the world? So Terry, talk a little bit about that journey. And frankly, I want to focus on the challenges and how you overcame the challenges.
When we started Refirm Labs, our intent, naively, was to approach the OEMs and ODMs who are manufacturing the IoT devices. We figure once we show them what we have, they can plug it into their software development lifecycle process. And at the very end of the development of that firmware image, our system would ingest it, reverse engineer it, look for all the problems, and report back to the development team, this stuff needs to be fixed before it actually goes to production. And then they would produce the most possibly secure IoT device possible. And that way you wouldn't have to worry about all these other IoT security solutions because it would be secure to begin with. And you can trace back the vast majority of attacks. I don't care, you name the attack, you name the devices, it all comes down to sloppy coding practice. So we thought this was an easy sell to the OEMs and ODMs over in China and Southeast Asia and Taiwan. Boy, was I wrong. They didn't want to spend another dime. They didn't give two craps about security. So we had to really think, oh my God, who's our buyer going to be? So we basically did a shotgun approach, and we went to the automotive industry, and we went to critical infrastructure. I mean, we didn't know anybody. I mean, thankfully, our investors were able to open some doors for us. But where we actually got traction up the supply chain was with the telco markets, because a lot of these devices were being compromised with very unsophisticated attack vectors, leveraging hard-coded usernames and passwords. And the telcos didn't know how to identify this stuff. I mean, they were doing traditional, as Karim said, penetration testing, run some automated tools against it. Yeah, it didn't crash, or there's no open ports, everything's fine. It's secure, let's put it in customers' homes. So once we demonstrated what we were able to do with the telcos, they saw what we brought to the table. And it was the telcos who are now today pushing back on those OEMs and ODMs, because as part of their procurement process for the latest set-top box that's sitting in your home, or Wi-Fi router or internet gateway, they're actually using our platform to find those backdoor accounts that may have accidentally or purposely been put in there, the sloppy coding practices, the zero-day exploits, known vulnerabilities, and they're pushing back on the supply chain. The supply chain doesn't like it. In fact, one global manufacturer of telco equipment, who was a customer of ours, or not a customer of ours, was getting our reports. They tracked us down on the internet, and they said, we're getting all these reports from our major telco customer about problems they're finding in our firmware. We don't know how they're finding them. Can you help us? So we helped them, and they became a subscriber. So now we're playing both sides of the equation here. We're working with the manufacturer of the device, and we're also working with the actual buyer of the device before they put them in their home. So it's a supply chain issue that we're attacking. Just like Karim mentioned earlier, that's where at least we think the risk is in the supply chain, and we're helping these telcos actually mitigate that risk early on in the process. And once our company has a repeatable sales process that's scalable in the telco market, then we can take this to other verticals where it'll apply just as well. Critical infrastructure, automotive, medical devices, you name it.
You know, it's interesting, when you talk about the vulnerability of these devices, I remember there was a breach of a major biopharma company about 8 years ago, and was not widely reported. But the compromise actually came in through the fax machine, you know, and you know, of all things, right? It's like people are getting ready to throw their fax machines out because they're irrelevant. Nobody thinks of that as an attack surface, you know. And the adversaries came in through the fax line. They were inside the network for 9 months. Turns out, coincidentally, in that process, they exfiltrated the results of $5 billion of pharmaceutical proprietary research, you know, to a foreign country, and actually began to destroy the original data when they were caught. So, you know, a good example of these IoT devices, these least capable devices, but when they're connected to a network,
Yep.
whether it's a fax machine or a refrigerator.
Let me give you another one real quick.
Okay, all right.
This, you can look this up on the internet. This actually some of you may actually know this. Now, I don't remember the name of the casino involved, but a casino in Vegas was hacked through a internet-connected thermometer in a fish tank in the lobby. Okay? So the attackers got in. They weren't attacking that. They were using it as a pivot point, just like an intelligence agency operative would do. We'd find the weakest point, we'd get in, and then we would start moving laterally. And what they ended up doing was actually stealing the entire high roller database of the casino. You can look it up. I can't remember the name of the casino off the top of my head. MGM.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you, Gregg.
Small world.
So yeah, look it up. It's you know, they attacked it through the internet-connected thermometer of the fish tank in the lobby and stole the high roller database.
Gregg, you know, when I first met Vesh, you know, and you know, and I asked him how, you know, he was 22 when I met him, right? I think.
Yeah, probably.
And I said, you know, Vesh, how old are you? He says, I'm 22, and it's like, how long do you work for the NSA? He goes, since I was 16. And my question was like, well, like right out of high school? And he goes, no, out of college. And it's just, you know, your head begins to spin with sort of the intellectual capacity that exists within these labs, their ability to attract absolutely phenomenally bright people who are motivated by, we're going to give you an intractable problem to solve and the resources to figure it out. Your journey with Vesh and Attila was kind of an interesting, you're seeing more of this from the NSA today in terms of finding ways for their expertise actually to get in to the marketplace so that industry can be more secure. Why don't you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, I'm so proud to see Vesh grow. I had the opportunity to kind of mentor Vesh when he first came out of the agency, and then had the opportunity to work with him, and now, you know, we've got a nice little company. He is a brilliant young engineer, but like a brilliant young engineer who's a millennial, we work at different schedules, we work at different paces, we work at different, you know, kind of methodologies. What I've had to do at Attila is really teach Vesh some very important things about selling, marketing, scalability. And what I've done, I have been very fortunate that I have a team that I've taken from company to company, and we've had the ability to prop Vesh up. So I've provided him with two very experienced senior engineering leaders that have taught Vesh, about scalability and about how to talk to a customer. And it's just been, for me, it's been a really rewarding journey as I've seen this brilliant young kid now morph into a CTO of a company that is really starting to thrive, that's solving a massive problem. And it's just, Bob, it's been so rewarding for kind of an old guy that's done this a lot of times. But this is a young man like some of my peers up here that will go on and do some amazing things, not only with the company that I'm running, but in his next company. But he's really need to be taught, how do you sell? How do you talk to an investor? And it's been an arduous path. I mean, I'll tell you, he really screwed up a couple meetings, right? And I mean, it really affected us. But then we go back and we work on him and we put him in front of a team and we beat him up and get him better in his presentation skills. We get him better to know how to talk to an investor. And we're really doing very, very well. And this young man his next company will be even better than what I have today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I remember when the Fort walked over with Vesh and the technology, and it was interesting. It's like, we developed this for ourselves. There's a whole bunch of other people that want it, and we're not known for our manufacturing prowess here at the NSA. We're kind of an engineering shop.
Right.
We need to get it out there so that people can take advantage of this and become more secure.
Right. And it's just been a wonderful journey for me, and I'm proud to see how he's developing, and as I said, I can't wait to see what he does down the road.
Ellison, and you guys did, I remember when you guys first started and the first technology coming out through PERC, from the Fort and the beginning of Enveil, and a lot of skepticism, around could this really be done? Talk about, you were so far ahead of the marketplace. Talk about that journey of finding the commercial market applications for your expertise and what that's like.
Yeah, so one other comment to that, Gregg. So as a counterpoint, not all intelligent people coming out of the agency are socially defunct. So there are some great, really smart people inside of the intelligence community and inside of the agency that are moving and shaking and starting new things and really intrapreneurs.
Absolutely right.
That can translate very well into the commercial world. So as another point, we formed inside of the agency, this technology to solve a very specific mission problem. So enabling trusted compute to occur in untrusted locations. So mission is the business of the intelligence community. So if you view it that way, you've got people who are solving real use cases from a business perspective in the context of the intel space.
Great point.
Now, that said, when we developed that to solve mission problems inside of the agency, i.e. business problems, we're so far ahead of what's going on in the commercial world. So we knew we had amazing technology that could be completely game-changing around how you think about where you can securely utilize and process data, share data, monetize data securely, et cetera. But we also knew that bringing that out, we would have to have the challenge and also privilege of building a whole new market in the commercial space. So in building a new market, we've got to define it. So secure data in use, give people a language to talk about it. And that's been quite a journey for us as we progressed over the last 2.5 years of the company. But we now see that coming together. So there is a common language, plethora of commercial use cases. So it's been an interesting experience.
Karim?
So I have the fortunate experience of working at a really interesting organization like Mandiant, which was legendary in its own right at the time. So I came from a very steeped environment of stretch a penny, you're private, you're not government, you don't have an unlimited, and with all due respect to you guys, times change and you go into that private sector world and you're like, wait, the budget doesn't show up next year? No, you got to make this work. And that really does forge really good, as Gregg probably put it, good habits about pivoting properly, failing fast, properly stretching your penny so you can actually get a product out in a really definitive time frame, and then take the even harder hurdle of going and marketing it and getting it market ready and interesting to people. With Prevailion, we very early on said this has to be palatable to the finance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the defense industry in the non-technical realm. They have to look at a dashboard that literally has the name of the firm, no metrics that requires an analyst to look at it. Otherwise, we're really pigeonholing ourselves to a very specific audience. My team, and my CTO, who is formerly on the offensive side of the NSA as well, it took a little bit for him to readjust and say, okay, I get why we don't need to do it that way. Can we still have it there? I said, yeah, but we need to have it be able to drill down to where once we get past the individual that's probably going to pay the bill, now we get into the guys that are going to execute. And those are the ones that want to see this. Bubbling up from there up to the top, it doesn't always work as well. So we've come to terms really well that way, where he's taken my experience with saying this has to be packaged in such a way that's palatable, because we're also telling a very, very scary story. And it's not only like post-mortem terrifying, it's future terrifying. So bedside manner with what we do is critical. And to Ellison's point, I think I've met all kinds of people that come from both sides, commercial and governmental, and there is no rule book there. I've met the worst bedside manner people in the commercial space and phenomenal bedside manner people from the government space. There's no rule book there, but that is a critical piece of what we all do, because it's hard enough to understand it, much less describe, by the way, you've got a horrific problem, now pay my bill.
I think one of the things that's really fascinating about having worked with all four of you and a lot of your colleagues from that similar background is the fact that you're doing it in Maryland. And I think when I first started looking at Maryland, what I saw, following Jay Kaplan and Orrin Falkowitz kind of back to the source, you find this phenomenally deep reservoir of very, very capable state-of-the-art engineering. But the challenges, the reason Jay and Orrin went to Silicon Valley is there was no support ecosystem in Maryland. Nobody knew, it was government services, great expertise. Nobody knew how to build a company. There was no venture capital ecosystem. It was barren land. So if you've got the most fertile plant in the world dropped in barren soil, it's not going to go very far. And you guys have we all get to work together. We get to work together through Data Tribe, which was really kind of came into being to create a lot of that Silicon Valley playbook and to drop it in to Maryland so that you would have a friend, a partner to provide some of those resources. But I look at what's going on in Maryland today, and you guys really are the cutting edge, that vanguard of building that ecosystem around cybersecurity and innovation. And it's easier to do it other places, but you chose to do it there. But I think you're able to tap in. One of the great things about Maryland that we found is it's the deepest reservoir of cyber engineering in the world is in Maryland, courtesy of the U.S. government. 109,000 cybersecurity engineers. University of Maryland graduates more cyber graduates than any other university system, in the country. 16 cyber centers of excellence. We talk about where's the oil. In cyber, the oil is in Maryland. It's not in Texas. It's not in Saudi Arabia. But it's a pioneering effort to be the first to kind of land and develop the expertise to basically grow that ecosystem. But you've all been successful in doing that. So congratulations to all of you. Really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to take just a second or two for questions. I know I need to wrap up, but let me get one question at least. Yes, sir.
If we're doing so good, why are we doing so bad? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, what is the impact of quantum computing going to do relative to security?
So the first question we can take an hour to answer, just because, and I think it goes back to my opening premise. We're all moving into the target zone. And we're moving into the target zone driven by efficiency, cost reduction, desire to move faster. Security is a secondary consideration. So every time we move into that threat zone, we're actually exposing ourselves to greater risk. And until we develop the discipline to understand that cybersecurity is a design requirement, we're going to be exposed.
Super simple answer that I think everyone's going to agree with. They can succeed once, and it's awesome, and fail a million times. We can fail once, and it's all over. That's the asymmetric problem.
I'm giving a high sign to wrap up. Let me thank all of you. I really appreciate y'all. Y'all came out from DC to do this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, guys.